When we're doing the all-time greatest with the Leafs, there is an all-time greatest. As much as they've been the butt of jokes really since the 80s, since I started watching hockey, there have been Leaf jokes, Leaf jokes, Leaf jokes. It's just and it won't stop. I'm going to be honest with Leaf fans, it won't stop until they win the Stanley Cup. If they went to the Stanley Cup Finals and lost in 7, they're still going to be there. Take it from a Canucks fan. It is a team that needs a 14th Stanley Cup. Desperately needs a 14th Stanley Cup. And they have a team right now that may very well challenge some of these teams in their greatness. But when we get into the all-time greatest, it's an interesting list. Their all-time points leaders Matt Sundin with 987. It is surprising that a team in Toronto that has had as much success in their past that they don't have a single 1,000-point player. That is surprising. Goals, Matt Sundin with 420. Apparently he and Bill Barber hang out together. I'm not judging. It's all legal in Canada now. So, yeah, Sundin with 420 goals. He is their all-time leader. Assists, Borje Salming with 620. And it's surprising Salming doesn't have 1,000 points as a Toronto Maple Leaf, as it is that Keon doesn't and various others. Power play goals leader all-time is Matt Sundin with 124. So when I talked about Sundin and his leadership with Toronto, there were Toronto fans that didn't like it, and there were Toronto fans that didn't like him, and there were Toronto fans that did like him. Divisive figure because it's Toronto. With the amount of fans that the Toronto Maple Leafs have, you're going to have very passionate fans, and you're going to have very differing opinions, and it's going to be more pronounced with Toronto because it is a larger group of people. So when people say, well, that happens in every team. Right, but with Toronto, you have so many of them. Penalty minutes leaders Max Domi with 2,265. Domi's greatest moment, of course, was when the guy fell in the penalty box, and Domi showed him what happens when a fan falls in the penalty box. That was one of the greatest hockey moments ever, wasn't it? So when we talk about their all-time greats, honestly, you've got so many Hall of Famers that have played for them. George Armstrong, Tim Horton, Daryl Sittler, Davey Keon, Rick Vaive I've got on the board because hey, he's their 50 goal scorer, their all-time or he's got the record for most goals by a Toronto Maple Leaf. Wendell Clark, Frank Mahovlich, Ted Kennedy, Bob Pulford, Doug Gilmour. He does deserve to be in there because of the 90s run. Red Horner, Babe Dye, Reg Noble, Sil Apps, Busher Jackson, Charlie Conacher, and it can just keep going. I can keep going for quite a while with guys who are in the Hall of Fame or have been some of the best players in the league and played for Toronto. The problem is, of course, that the Harold Ballard era really stripped that down, and it really tore it to pieces. And the franchise, up until recently, had a really hard time consistently being good. I think with the group they have now, they can get there, but, and I know people are going to say, what about the late 90s, early 2000s? There was some trying to buy their way to the Stanley Cup that was going on there, which you really can't do under the cap era. So I do respect what teams do in the cap era, probably a little bit more than pre-cap, although there were some pretty good ones there. So yeah, Toronto, lot of good players. Goaltender, Turk Broda leads them in wins with 304. Again, it's kind of surprising that it takes 304 to be the all-time wins leader for Toronto. Save percentage, Jacques Plante, 925. Yeah, nobody's going to reach that. Shots against, Johnny Bower, 14,607. It is likely that Freddy Anderson reaches that total, so Anderson may end up on the board at some point. Shutouts, Turk Broda with 61. So Turk Broda, probably the best goalie these guys have had, but Johnny Bower, he wouldn't tell them how old he was. That's how determined Johnny Bower was to quote prove himself. He wouldn't tell them how old he was. And there was always like a running joke about how old he might be and speculation because Bower just kept going out and playing. How old are you? I don't care. I'm going to go out and play for the Leafs. You got it. Good thing you're still good, Johnny Bower. So when you talk about honorable mentions with Bower, Plante, Broda, and Plante didn't play there for very, very long. So Jacques Plante I could have had over here, but I didn't because he's right there. Curtis Joseph deserves a lot of credit for that early 2000s, late 90s. Paul Matier, and of course, Joseph was... They went through the share of goaltenders. They had Joseph, they had Belfour, they had Potvin. They're all in that same era of the Leafs getting close and getting into contendership and almost contender and kind of sort of contender and then not quite. But Mike Palmateer gets into the conversation and Harry Lumley as well. as a pretty darn good goaltender that played for the Toronto Maple Leafs. But in terms of their all-time best goalie, I can't see how I don't go with Johnny Bower. Of the two, I would go with Bower. Broda, I guess, is second, and either way, you're in pretty good shape. I don't have Freddy Anderson on the list because to me, Anderson's not in that category. Potvin played a nice long time for Toronto Maple Leafs, and so Potvin gets an honorable mention for the amount of wins he's put up. Maybe Freddy Anderson a couple years from now, if I do this again, gets on the board. Now, their most points actually is 105 from 2017-2018. This is not a team that's had a ton of points in any given season. And it really underscores just how, since the expansion era, this team has struggled with being a success and getting to that level of being an elite team in the NHL. Their best overall team, I went with the 1962-63 Stanley Cup winners, who had 9 Hall of Famers. Frank Mahovlich, Red Kelly, Davey Keon, Bob Pulford, George Armstrong, Tim Horton, Alan Stanley, Al Arbor, and Johnny Bower. So, 9 Hall of Famers. Not all Hall of Famers because of what they did as players, but still, 9 Hall of Fame guys on that roster. And the 63 team was pretty impressive. It was right in the middle of, that's the second Stanley Cup winner. They won 3 in a row. That was the second one. So I went with that as their best team. But not the most points. The most points was 2017-2018. Their consecutive seasons, from 1931 till 1945, they had 15 straight years in the playoffs. And that's still their record. So Toronto has had success, but it's been a matter of since the expansion era, since 67, it's been elusive. Now, their most wins against any one team, Montreal, no surprise there. 300 wins against Montreal. I will note, though, that is below 500 against Montreal, but they've played Montreal so many times. Points percentage against the Anaheim Ducks, they have a .674 winning percentage. Goals for, they've scored 2,077 goals in the regular season against Montreal. So again, they've allowed more than that, but they've scored a ton. Goals for per game against Edmonton, they've scored 3.63. Noteworthy, they allowed 3.81 against Edmonton that period. I do remember Toronto and Edmonton games in the 80s being very high-scoring affairs between two teams that defensively might not have bothered with the whole defensive side of the puck too much. Goals against per game continues this run of teams from the 90s expansion and beyond. Against the Minnesota Wild, 2.25 goals against per game. So not too bad. Notable captains. It's quite the list, isn't it? And I didn't include Rob Ramage. So John Tavares is their captain right now. And he could very well find himself in the all-time great Maple Leafs by the time he's retired. Dion Phaneuf. Phaneuf belongs on the board because he was captain for, 6 years? He belongs on the board. Matt Sundin, Doug Gilmour, Wendell Clark, Rick Vive, Daryl Sittler, Davey Keon, George Armstrong, Ted Kennedy, Sil Apps, and Hap Day, who was their first ever captain. He's a Hall of Famer as well, and I didn't put him under the all-time greats list. Because, again, I just could have kept going. I reached Charlie Conacher, and I'm like, all right, that's enough. That's enough, the honorable mention stuff. And it shows that Toronto does have a really good history. So, it's the reality of when. It's the when part. And they need that next cup ring, really. Best coach, I went with Punch Imlach, who was there from 1957 till 1980. That's a very long time as coach. By the time he left as coach, it was time, but that was at a time where the Leafs, they were going through some issues. Best GM, I went with Conn Smythe. Conn Smythe was their general manager for 30 years. They won a number of Stanley Cups under Conn Smythe. I think it was 1927 till 1957, and that would include this nice run of consecutive playoffs. Conn Smythe, obviously a huge figurehead in the NHL, and there's a trophy with his name on it because of his influence in the game. Now, the He Was a Leaf list. It is a long one, isn't it? And I could have made it longer. Now, technically, I could have put Bernie Parent on the list, but Parent, his rights were owned by the Toronto Maple Leafs. He goes to the WHA, and then when he came back, he's traded to Philadelphia. So, there you go. Jerry Cheevers was a Maple Leaf for basically that long. He was a Maple Leaf. Ken Linsman, basically the same thing. Linsman only played a couple of games there. Tom Barroso was a Maple Leaf towards the end of his career. Ron Francis, he had a brief appearance as a Maple Leaf. I believe it was 12 games. Brian Leach was a Maple Leaf. It was weird. Almost as weird as him being a Bruin. He was doing the original 6 tour. Sadly, only reached 3 of them. Mike Pekka was a Maple Leaf, not for a whole long time. Eric Lindros was a Maple Leaf. And it was a big deal when he goes to Toronto, but at that point he was already dealing with massive injury problems, and we knew he wasn't going to play a full season. Andy Bathgate was a member of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Marion Stastny I thought was a curiosity because I had forgot Marion Stastny was a member of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And the Stastny brothers, all 3 of them together, it didn't last that long in Quebec, and Marion ends up in Toronto. Dave Semenko was a Maple Leaf for a season. Joe Nieuwendyk was a Toronto Maple Leaf for roughly the same period of time as Semenko. Owen Nolan, Maple Leaf for him as well. Kirk Muller, Toronto Maple Leaf, not for very long. Randy Carlyle, also Toronto Maple Leaf. I believe that was at the start of his career before he goes to Pittsburgh. Joel Quenneville, Toronto Maple Leaf. And it's easy to forget that guys like Quenneville and Carlyle, who become famous coaches and kind of big names in the hockey world, they were Maple Leafs. Terry Sawchuk was a Maple Leaf, which is kind of well known, but if you're not a Maple Leaf fan, you may not know. And Mike Gartner was a Maple Leaf as well. And of course, a lot of Hall of Famers on there who may not be in the Hall of Fame for what they did in Toronto, but they still passed through Toronto. A lot of players have played for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And so there we go. The all-time greats of the Toronto Maple Leafs. It's a pretty big list. And I don't have Matthews on the list. Matthews, to me, is not on that level. I can't have Matthews on the same level as Horton, Keon, Sittler. He hasn't played as long as Vive did either. So I don't have him on that same level, but we'll see. We'll see the next time around whether or not guys like Marner and Matthews and them, to me, they have to at least win a round. Most of the guys on this board at least got out of the first round with the Maple Leafs, and that's important. Now, during the 80s, right, Maple Leafs were being run really, really badly by Harold Ballard. But still, postseason success does make a difference when you're looking at all-time greats, whether that's right or wrong, whether that's fair or not. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video, and the all-time greats of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Thank you guys so much for all your support. Remember, stay home, stay safe, wash your hands. I will talk to you again soon.